Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Anne, for the introduction. Thank you to this forum for the kind invitation. I suspect that amongst the speakers, I'm possibly the only one well qualified to feel for the Ukraine, to the extent that we Greeks and you Ukrainians suffered more or less the same loss of GDP over the last 10 years. We suffered a little bit more, but let's not have a contest along the lines of Monty Python, who had a worst experience in life. But allow me to make a point which I think is not insignificant. At least you folks, you've had a war. You've had an external threat. I'm not going to take sides on this, but it's a fact. And you also had, prior to that, you had a squeeze which was externally induced regarding fuel prices. So in other words, if you're a Ukrainian, you don't need to become a very accomplished economist in order to understand what went wrong in the case of the Ukrainian economy. When you have guns blazing, when you have a clear and present threat from the outside your borders, it's very easy to see why your economy has suffered. Of course, that does not mean that there are no endogenous issues within and structural issues within the Ukrainian economy that are to a large extent also responsible for your situation. Whereas we Greeks, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we experienced stability, inclusion in the European Union, inclusion in the European Monetary Union. I remember immediately after our entry into the Eurozone, we had a period, many years, of 5% growth, real GDP growth, and the whole of the establishment in Greece, but also in Europe, were treating Greece as a success story. And suddenly, the bubble burst, of course, and people were puzzled. This puzzlement, not knowing what hit you, what went really wrong. Everybody has a theory, of course. But this puzzlement, when you have the lack of an external, clear foe, an external cause, like you did here in the Ukraine, is soul-destroying. It causes a lot of soul-searching, but it is also a source of great existential angst for a country like Greece. But then again, we economists, we only have a job. There's only something called economics. Because of this intense puzzlement as a result of the crisis that emerged together with the great opportunities of globalization and of capitalism. And when I say globalization, Jonathan, I don't mean the globalization you're referring to. I'm talking about the earlier globalization of the 18th, 17th and 18th century. The reason why Adam Smith wrote economics and invented the subject, more or less, was because something remarkable was happening at the end of the 18th century in Britain. You had the rise of spectacular new wealth and productivity and steam engines and so on. And at the same time, spectacular new forms of deprivation and poverty that had never been witnessed before. The poverty of the English working class had never been encountered even in the worst parts of the world. So this contrast, this contradiction, is always part and parcel of what makes us experience both an existentialist crisis and a deep need to get to grips with what really is going on in our world. Now, today, if you were to read the Financial Times this morning, or the Wall Street Journal, you would find another interesting, another delicious contradiction. We had, after many months of waiting, the official announcement that quantitative easing in the United States is being wound down, or it will be wound down. The tapering announcement was made, as you probably know. And at the same time, in the same newspaper, in the Financial Times, there is a big read story of why is inflation so low? You know, what happened to the boosts in inflation that QE and easy loose money was going to create. So this is puzzlement again. And what I want to do is today, because Anne gave me a remit that is ridiculously wide, but also extremely satisfying in the sense that I'm not going to get bored speaking. Maybe you will. What I want to do today is I want to talk about the contradiction that we have been facing for a while now. I call it an unbalanced equilibrium or a balanced disequilibrium. It's a question of semantics. And the feeling that most of us get, independently of whether we agree or disagree, that we are in uncharted waters. That for the first time since the 1940s, we are all confused. There's very little room these days for certainty. Once upon a time, the monetarists were certain about their mantra, the Keynesians were certain about theirs, the Marxists about theirs. Nothing. We are all, if we are slightly, even ever so slightly, honest with ourselves, we're all puzzled. And we all see that the world we live in cannot be explained anymore on the basis of the certainties of the pre-2008 world. So allow me to use the next 10 minutes of my allotted time to tell you where I'm coming from, how I experience this. I shall make a working hypothesis that after 1944, we had three main phases. We had the Bretton Woods era, and that was followed by a period of massive disruption which led to globalization, financial globalization. We've had globalizations then ever since we left Africa and conquered the rest of the world as a species. But globalization is not that. Globalization is financial globalization. Let's be clear on that. And then we have the post-2008 period. Now, since I'm also going to be speaking about the Eurozone and the European Union, Bretton Woods is a good way of starting, a good place to start, because remember what Bretton Woods was. It was a heavily planned global economic and financial system. It was a system of fixed exchange rates that were administered at the level of the IMF as a result of bargaining between treasuries. One may say, well, what's so different to the gold exchange standard of the mid-war period? I'll tell you what the difference is. There's one difference, and it's huge. The difference is not so much whether the currencies were linked pegged to the dollar, which was pegged to gold, or directly to gold. No, the difference was that in 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the global plan that was that prevailed was one that was predicated both on fixed exchange rates and on global surplus recycling, where the one economic bloc that was exiting the Second World War with a surplus, the United States of America, was willfully choosing to recycle its own surpluses in Europe and in Japan. Something that the gold exchange standard did not require. Now, this is important because, you see, when you bind together disparate economies, deficit and surplus economies, with a fixed exchange rate, a peg, or indeed a common currency, as we're doing in the European Union, in our infinite wisdom, the first thing that happens, of course, is that there is a massive flow of capital from the surplus countries, from the surplus regions to the deficit regions. This is what happens every single time you bind together through a fixed exchange rate, a deficit and surplus country. Now, the reason why a surplus country is a surplus country is because its level of industrial development and economic development generally is such that you have excess capacity, oligopolistic sectors that are highly efficient in a Schumpeterian sense, and therefore they are bound together with deficit economies, like you have on the panel in German and the Greek. This is a good example here. You bind together Germany and Greece, and you have the Volkswagens and the Siemenses on one hand, with substantial price-cost margins and excess capacity, and oligopoly power, and then you have a stream of haircutters and restaurateurs and perfect competition, not perfect competition, but competition with very low price-cost margins, very low efficiency, very low productivity, and very low indebtedness. Because let me remind you something, well, let me tell you something I'm sure you don't know. The reason why Greece entered the European Union, or was allowed to enter the European Common Market back then, was because we had something that was appreciated in Paris and in Bonn then, and in Brussels. The lowest level of debt, private and public, in Europe. Can you believe that? Private debt was non-existent, and public debt was extremely low. So the reason why capital flows from a surplus to the deficit region is low levels of private debt in the deficit region and very heavy demand for capital. So effective interest rates in the deficit country are higher than they are in the surplus country, only because of the excess demand for credit in poorer, less advanced countries. That creates irrational exuberance in the deficit countries. We Greeks, not we, all of us, but a certain class of Greeks went crazy, buying Porsche Cayennes and French wine on the basis of vendor financing. So, we want your car and we want your money to buy the car with. And of course, because of this, whenever you have a large current account surplus, in a surplus country, you also have surplus money splashing around in the banks of the surplus country that is dying to be lent to the deficit country. That creates bubbles in the deficit country, a false sense of growth, the 5% growth I was referring to, and then eventually the bubbles burst. And if you do not have a mechanism by which to control those financial flows before the accident happens and after the accident happens, the burden of adjustment falls on the weakest of shoulders, and then either the monetary union breaks down, or you're going to have austerity-driven repression in the deficit countries, which then cause the surplus countries to try to find markets for their net exports elsewhere, therefore exporting deflation to the rest of the world. This was the case in the 1920s and 1930s. It was the case in Latin America whenever a fixed exchange rate, a peg, was created between the Argentinian peso, let's say, and the US dollar. It was the case in the 1980s in the European Union with the European exchange rate mechanism. That system broke down. Then we created the euro to make it so rigid, so impossible to break, that you had the deflationary spout after 2010. Now, the standard narrative today is that we have overcome all this. We've come out on the other end, and despite the architectural problems in Europe and in the global economy, we have recovered. Well, allow me to argue against complacency. As a Greek, I've suffered the ill effects of complacency. We have been, as a nation, complacent for far too long. I look at the federal election campaign now in Germany and I recognize the same complacency, that business as usual is the optimal strategy. It was not our optimal strategy in Greece in 2002, 2003, 2004. It's not the optimal strategy now in Germany or indeed anywhere. The Bretton Woods period that I was referring to before was, and this I think substantiates and reinforces some of the things that Jonathan was saying before. It was a period when inequality shrunk massively, growth was robust and constant, inflation was at its lowest, and that created the stability and the political legitimacy which was necessary for our societies to get closer together, and indeed, within Europe, to be able to create the miracle of the European Union. But it was American managed. We Europeans have this amazing audacity of celebrating the European Union as a European achievement. It is not a European achievement. It was an American design implemented to a very large extent by American decision makers and administrators against the will, particularly of Paris. But that's a big story. I'm not going to get into this now. It's another talk. Yeah, you want me to speak for 20 or 25 minutes? I've got it here. Okay. All right. I'm going to speak for 25 minutes all up. So I've got a very large clock here, Anne. Look. All right. So, what happened after? Bretton Woods could not survive, and could not survive because, as I said, it was predicated upon surplus recycling by the surplus nation. That nation stopped being in surplus by the end of the 1960s. Paul Volcker answered a question put to him by Henry Kissinger in 1970, a year before the end of Bretton Woods. Henry Kissinger then was in the National Security Advisor before he moved on to the State Department, and he asked his minions, Paul Volcker being one of them, how can we ensure that we maintain our global dominance given that we're no longer a surplus nation? Typical Henry Kissinger question, right? Geopolitical. And Paul Volcker was the one who actually gave a delicious answer in a memo which was 3/4 of a page, which I have a copy of. Very unsung memo. I think this should be compulsory reading. He said, well, it doesn't really matter whether you have surpluses or not. What matters is that you do the surplus recycling. So if you don't have a surplus to recycle, you might as well recycle other people's surpluses, which is exactly what the United States economy has been doing since the end of Bretton Woods. And this was a period, at least until 2008. Think about it. The United States economy was operating like a huge vacuum cleaner for years, sucking into its territory the net exports of Germany, of Holland, of Japan, later of China, and closing the loop by also sucking into Wall Street 70% of profits earned by German industrialists, Dutch, Japanese, and later Chinese. And of course, financialization was absolutely essential for that, because you cannot have a tsunami of capital rushing into Wall Street from all over the world, day in, day out, about 5 billion net every day on average per working day for a period of 28 years, without deregulation. So deregulation was not something that was ideologically driven. The ideology came later. The ideology of neoliberalism, for me, was the essential rebooting of the mindset that went hand in hand with this recycling mechanism, this unbalanced equilibrium. Unbalanced because what was going on between the late 1970s and 2008 was the deficits were getting larger, the imbalances, both in terms of current accounts and capital accounts, were growing, but the two were finding a kind of dynamic equilibrium and creating the requisite demand for the gleaming factories of Germany, of Holland, of Japan, and later of China. On the back of this tsunami of capital, of course, what happens when you give bankers a few billion every day to play with, even if you give it to them for 10 minutes? They find ways of wagering it. They find ways of making it grow. They find, exotic instruments by which to, divide and multiply it. And this is exactly what happened. In 2008, those pyramids, as we all know, I'm not going to tie you with things we all have experienced and still experience the repercussions of, they just imploded. Now, the tragedy is that this is how we move into the third period, the third phase after the Second World War, in my estimation. Even though the current account deficits have come back to where they were before before the crisis of 2008, the capital flows have not. The capital flows remain unbalanced, but now they're unbalanced in the sense that they are failing to provide capital for companies and enterprises and economic activities which are capable of producing the good quality jobs that there is such a dearth of. So we have a structural break in the history of capitalism. This constant dearth of aggregate demand, this incongruity, if you look at, for instance, the rate of return to capital that is being used in order to buy back the shares of their own company, which has been the last couple of years, has been something like 200, it's been almost twice the rate of return of other equity, and a multiple of the real interest rate. That simply tells you that we are facing a unique imbalance between aggregate savings and aggregate investment in productive activities. And of course, the moment you state that, you realize why you have negative interest rates still in the European Union, and why you have this puzzle, on the one hand, of seemingly a recovery, which is, however, predicated on increasing imbalances that engender a great deal of complacency, when under the surface we are witnessing financial imbalances that smack of 2002. And I mean 2002. Remember 2002? It was a year after the dot-com bubble burst, and when loose money made everybody think, oh, well, it's okay. The Great Depression has been, or a recession, a large recession has been avoided, or a depression has been avoided. The simple point I'm going to make is that never before in the history of capitalism did we need a rethink about the global financial architecture. I'm going to just put it on the table so that we can then have a discussion about this and some controversy, that today we have as much of a need of a recalibration of the global architecture as we did in 1944. We need a new Bretton Woods. By this, what I mean is we need to have another meeting of the G20, the G30, the G40, to discuss two things. Firstly, how can the unwinding of unsustainable debts and losses in the context of tapering both in the United States and European Union can be combined with a substantial increase in investment into the things humanity needs. Markets have proven beyond reasonable doubt that they're incapable of effecting this recalibration, just like they were incapable of doing it in 1944. Now, that does not mean that the new Bretton Woods should be a copy or an extension of the old Bretton Woods. We are never going to go back to fixed exchange rates. But the old certainties of a strict and cozy separation between fiscal policy and monetary policy, between money and debt, certainties that we had. Money and debt are much more intertwined since financialization than they've been. Fiscal policy and monetary policy, especially in the European Union, especially the European Monetary Union, are one and the same thing. Ask Mario Draghi, he knows. We have institutions that still pretend that we live in the pre-2008 world and which are utterly incapable of handling the challenges of today. Countries like ours, like Ukraine, like Greece, like Germany, we have a lot of homework to do, as the Germans would say. We have a great deal of reforming to plan and implement. But the major problems we face, which are four: public debt, private debt, and banking losses, underinvestment at the global scale, except China, which is the only counteracting force. We'll discuss this later if need be. And fourth, the rise of new forms of poverty and exclusion. These are common to all of us. They cannot be sorted out in Ukraine by Ukrainian action They cannot be sorted out in Germany through German action. They cannot be sorted out in the United States, especially in today's ungovernable United States of A. It's a bit like climate change. All of these four realms, either we get together, like we did in 1944, maybe not in New Hampshire, maybe in Germany somewhere, Bavaria, let's say. Or we're going to be constantly reliving different variants of the crisis that began in 2008. Thank you.